Welcome to and Happy New Year to everyone for our first installment of the series that NAESP will be offering on the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, otherwise known as ESSA. My name is Kelly Pollitt. I serve as the Chief Strategist of Policy and Alliances at NAESP. I'd like to extend a special and warm welcome to the principals joining this session today and to others who will be joining to discuss this very important topic. Over the past several years, particularly the past 5, we've worked diligently on Capitol Hill and with the administration to represent the voice and perspective of principals on the reauthorization of ESSA. And we're now excited to share that we're finally at a point where we can have a new law that better acknowledges, supports, and builds the capacity of principals. We're eager to get started with you today, but first, please note again, this is our first working session with an overview of Title I with principals and with other stakeholders who care about the education of children, especially young children. We're anxious to dive into the various components of the new law, but before we begin, I do want to make sure that folks know this is not in any way a legal type of presentation. We're here to share with you an overview of the Title I requirements and how principals can impact implementation going forward. As the catalyst for change and sustained improvement, we're honored to continue to support our nation's leaders and continue to champion the interests of all pre-K-8 principals. This couldn't be more important because we know the success of the new law will depend on your ability to lead and be empowered to set the optimum conditions for learning. So we're going to get to business. And with that, I'm very, very pleased to introduce a phenomenal colleague and partner for this particular webinar and good friend, Dr. Rich Long. Rich, go ahead and say hi to folks.
Thank you, Kelly. It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to our session.
So Rich is an author and consultant, what I would consider the premier expert on Title I with over 20 years experience working on Title I issues, literacy, professional development, and how to use funds from multiple federal sources. He's consulted with the National Title I Association, the International Reading Association, NCTE, the World Health Organization, and is an author and written extensively on the history of federal education policy. There's no one here in Washington, D.C. who knows education policy and its history better than Dr. Long. So welcome.
Thank you.
Here we go. Before we get started, 2 things. First, everyone should know, and then we hope you have heard by now, we have a new law. ESSA reauthorization is complete. It was signed into law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, on December 10th. Shortly after Congress passed it, it was literally a day and a half waiting, and you can see a picture here of the leaders on Capitol Hill who were responsible for making this happen. And honestly, it could never have happened without a bipartisan process. And while the bulk of the drafting of the legislation took place over the past year in 2015, it shouldn't discount the amount of work in the previous years that went into really setting the stage for what would become the new basis of federal education policy and moving away from test and punish policies. So before we get any further, we want to take a little poll and see where folks are on this new law. How much have you reviewed? How much do you know? How deep would you like us to get into our discussion today? We'll have 3 options in your poll. Now, Honor's going to go ahead and launch that. So you'll see your options are A, B, and C. A, you're an expert. You've reviewed this new law. You pretty much know what's in it and you understand the major shifts in accountability assessment. And you're here today to go a little bit deeper on those areas, perhaps learn a little bit more. Or B, you know about the new law. You're fairly familiar with what kinds of shifts are about to take place, but you want to know more to fully understand what those major shifts are. Or C, you're really not have had the time or wherewithal to read all 391 pages of Title I and otherwise, and you're here to learn about this new bill.
And in fact, Kelly, I think that it's fair to say that most people have not been able to read and fully digest this statute. especially with the Christmas holidays and time off with families. Hopefully they did get to see shows like Star Wars.
Well, that's right, and I'm hoping a lot of you will pick C.
We also, though, in doing today's webinar, want to also, again, reiterate that we're going to give you essentially a strategic overview of where you should be thinking about deciding where to invest your time and energies and getting much, much deeper into the weeds. There are a lot of changes in this statute we're going to talk about, and a lot of things that haven't changed. There's some nuances that have changed that are different than some of the specifics that maybe you were used to and the prescriptiveness of No Child Left Behind and the waivers. Excuse me. Great.
So as you'll see, we're fully prepared to share with you additional details, give you a great overview, some tips, and really help you understand the new intent of the law. So let's go ahead and get started. We've planned for you today a few areas that we've categorized into these 4 buckets. So as I noted, generally we'll be giving you an overview of select provisions of Title I of ESSA, highlight the effective dates in the major shifts in policy, the big bucket areas. So those will primarily be accountability and assessment. Obviously there are other areas of Title I which we'll touch on briefly, and both Rich and I will be sort of tag teaming each issue to make sure that we're covering them not in great depth, but enough so that you understand exactly what's in this new law. Then we'll be reviewing select provisions that should be, well, that are most important for principals to understand, and then point to how principals can have an impact as the new law is being considered, digested, and then new procedures will be put in place for implementation, and how your voice matters and where you should be, and really, for the first time legislatively, can legally insert your name in consultation with states and districts.
And that's one of the things that we do want to be emphasizing all throughout here, the nuances of consultation. It is not a, I have been through several reauthorizations, and this one has many more points of discussion where the difference, as they call them in DC, stakeholder groups. But those stakeholder groups, like yourselves, are also going to be interacting with others who are going to be getting specific information from their counselors. And so there will be a whole lot of need to be precise at certain times, but also make selective decisions as to where you want to interact.
So, and just to underscore that, I would say one of the bigger takeaways of the new policies is it's turning NCLB almost on its head to be more bottom-up as opposed to top-down. And there are very specific levers or areas of the policy that shift decision points from the federal level to the state and local and give you plenty of opportunity to weigh in. So let's get started and look at a few of those. But first, here's some funding.
And Kelly, one of the things we were talking about just a little bit earlier, one of the phenomenal things about the new statute is it's only a 4-year authorization.
Yes.
And here are year by year the funding levels amounts. And what you will note here is that it really doesn't go up all that amount greatly. However, one of the things that's important to note is that the authorization doesn't go down. Having said that, we should also be aware that since 1965, when almost $1 billion was appropriated for Title I and ESSA at that point, if we looked at how much money is now being spent, in 1965 dollars, the amount of money is $1.4 billion. So we haven't kept pace with inflation, which also talks a lot about how continually you are being asked to do a whole lot more complex things with actually less resources on a year-to-year basis.
So with Rich's point, I can say that now that we have finished ESSA reauthorization, NAESP will be repivoting and bolstering its efforts to advocate for increased funding for Title I. And obviously now that we have some approved authorization levels, we'll be pushing for this and more.
And this next slide that's coming up is going to highlight to you that there is a whole lot of changes here that we're referring to, but there's also a lot of things that haven't changed. Some of these things actually haven't changed since the 1970s, and because these continued reauthorizations and there are politics that limit the amount of change that can occur and the changes in definition. So this is very much an amalgamation of old and new. And so we're going to go over with you, and Kelly's going to lead off, is the section here on what's changing.
Right, and I think it's important really to focus on those big shifts. So first and foremost, we're very pleased that the new bill eliminates AYP, and in its place, states must develop an index of accountability with long-term goals that are measured through certain indicators. And we are going to dig into this issue a little later in the presentation. So I'll turn over to Rich to talk about the new teacher requirements.
There are a lot of changes in the teacher program. For instance, the highly qualified teacher concept is gone. However, at the same time, the idea of reporting and documenting how teachers who are working, especially with those in greatest needs, what sort of backgrounds that they have by way of experience, by way of certification, by way of time in essentially in grade level, how they compare between the kids who are being very successful outside of Title I and kids who would be in Title I and how they're being challenged is going to be an important requirement. However, the requirement that we had because of the waivers that were given to well over 40 of the states, they have been totally vacated as of August of this year.
So school improvement grants, we're very happy to say that the school improvement grant program will no longer be in existence. There are some effective dates that we'll talk about in transition, but we're very pleased that the school improvement models specifically will be going away, and instead we'll have replaced more of a capacity building approach at the local level. So in place of school improvement, corrective action, restructuring, supplemental services, we have two categories where schools will be identified as comprehensive support and improvement or targeted support and improvement. Now, beginning in the school year 2017-2018 and once every 3 years, this is where states will be identifying schools. I'm going to provide, just a side note here, a little bit more on the school improvement program because it's not one of our big bucket areas that we dig into. But just again, to give you a flavor of what the new school improvement program will be. It will begin school year 2017-18, as I noted, and once every 3 years, states will identify schools for comprehensive support and improvement. States will be required to set exit criteria for schools after they're identified, and they're identified based on the 5% lowest performing in the state as determined by the State Accountability Index and a differentiation process. Differentiated accountability was a big priority in changing and shifting the nature of accountability in federal education policy. The second criteria, which applies to high schools that graduate less than 2/3 or 67% of their students, and schools for which a subgroup is consistently underperforming in the same manner as the lowest 5% in the state. So again, that's a little weedy. There's a lot of detail there. But what we can tell you is generally the takeaway is the new policy really puts in place more of a capacity building approach for schools that need that extra support. There's also obviously a school improvement plan that will have to be developed by the school, and on that point there's lots of language in the new law that fosters and requires consultation with principals, parents, even students in some cases, to develop these new plans, and the LEAs will be responsible for not only approving plans but monitoring implementation and making sure there are sufficient resources for schools to implement their new school improvement plans. So I'll turn it over to Rich to talk about the parent engagement strategies.
The parent engagement strategies are essentially both similar and different in this statute from the old statute. There's still the invitation requirement to spend 1% on parent involvement, parent engagement. There's also requirements through the Title I portion about how much money should be spent or could be spent on communication with parents on various specific elements, and we will be talking about a little bit later the direct service element. There's also requirements all through both Title I and the other parts of the statute on evidence-based strategies. Unlike in No Child Left Behind, where the definition of this and scientifically based was running all the way through, the concept here is much more in line with what the thinking has become in the last 5 years about what evidence is, what fact-based decision-making is about. So you will find that requirement all the way through your program and requiring you to talk about in any report and evaluation system what your evidence is. We also know...
But before you move on, Rich, sorry, I just want to add that the statute again does define evidence-based, and for those of you who would be familiar with the I-3 grants, there's a level of rigor in those particular grants and programs that are approved that the bill actually seeks to emulate. So it's defined in the bill as being strong evidence with at least one well-designed experimental study, moderate evidence from one well-designed quasi-experimental study, or promising evidence from at least one well-designed correlational study. You can also include, as part of your evidence base, ongoing evaluation and proven strategies. So that does shift the definition of evidence base quite a bit from previous iterations of the law.
And we also have listed here early childhood education coordinating services. One of the things you'll find throughout this entire statute, not just in Title I, is that there are much more explicit requirements related to early childhood education. They're trying to, specifically related to Title I, that requirement is being explicit that early childhood education in Title I is a area where funds can be spent. One of the things you will note, though, that throughout the statute is that there is an entire new requirement that's put in here that has the coordinating agency as the Department of Health and Human Services. And we'll touch a little bit more on that later.
Well, and we couldn't be more excited about the intentional and deliberate language on early childhood in Title I, and actually stronger language throughout the other sections of the law that talk about the important role of principals in pre-K-3 alignment. However, in the nature of time, we'll be moving on. Stay tuned for future presentations. So here we're going to talk a little bit about transition and what does that mean. And mostly, right now, we can give you a snapshot of timeline and over the coming year, what you can expect, important dates. Now, these are statutory dates. They're not necessarily related to anything having to do with regulation. But they're important because these are dates that the Department of Education took note of. They passed along with the law, and it's a basic timeline to help think about the next year, and it really tracks a lot with funding and the school or programmatic years. So the takeaway, however, is don't panic. Don't worry over the next year, as processes and procedures will be put in place. Please expect to maintain current practices through the 2016-2017 school year. Go ahead. The other important piece of any law is the accompanying or subsequent regulations. Now, we can tell you this. We know that the Department of Education is on top of the new law, and prior to the Christmas holiday, and in fact on December 16, 18, and then officially in the Federal Register on December 22nd, the U.S. Department of Education took the first step in what will be potential regulatory process, well, what we know will be the regulatory process, particularly on Title I. Now, the department released, and this is a very Washington wonky RFI, which is a request for information. It's not a rule-setting step. It's the very first step, initial phase, where the department is collecting information from the field, from practitioners and from stakeholder groups on where they should be regulating in Title I and where they should be issuing non-binding policy guidance. And that's really documents that help states and districts implement the law. And again, it's a request for information. You should know that it precedes the NPRM, which again, don't worry about this acronym. It's a very Washingtonian word, but it refers to the official rulemaking process. And it's what will happen as the law is interpreted, digested, and then put forward out to states. So right now, I do want to point out two things. First, NAESP is collecting any and all comments from principals about Title I issues in order to respond to this initial request for information from the U.S. Department of Education. Honor is going to go ahead and type out an email address that you can send any and all comments to, not only about Title I and a request for information, but any questions that you have. If we don't get to them by the end of this webinar, you can please feel free to send them to title1@naesp.org. So the bottom line is, don't wait for all this regulation and things to come. We can give you a good guesstimate of the timeline, which we expect after this initial 30-day comment period, the department may move in the subsequent 2 or 3 months to start putting together their notices of new rules that will be coming. Two issues that were highlighted in this notice that we want to point out, supplement, not supplant, and then assessment. We expect the department will definitely be regulating on those two issues. So if you have thoughts about them, please send them to the email address that Honor put up. With that being said, again, you'll note here, don't wait. States are starting to work on their plans now. We can definitely encourage you at this point, if you haven't already, to reach out to your state and local officials and begin talking about their perspective in the transition on Title I.
The procedures in place for transition, this is a really important concept. Unlike the last time, for those of you who survived going from the previous to No Child Left Behind, this is not going to be a cold shock treatment. For most of you, you will find that what you've been doing in this school year, you will be allowed to do for next school year. So the procedures in place, there's not a new clock starting on No Child Left Behind because the waivers are being taken away. There's not going to be this new imposition of the requirements for school improvement and those types of programs. There probably will be more clarity from the department on some of these points so that the states are covered. There are some ambiguities in here. I've been talking to people both in the department and in other groups to try to get this clarified. I think this is something that it's everyone's intent. Now, part of the whole rulemaking process that you need to understand is there are parts of the new statute which are going to go to what's called negotiated rulemaking. That has a certain amount of time that takes to it. When rules are, as Kelly pointed out, the NPRM notice of proposed rulemaking, that starts a clock that can take as long as 180 days, which will take us into the beginning of the next school year, which is one of the reasons why the Congress very intentionally wanted to give a phase-in period so that you wouldn't be caught having to essentially to try to meet the requirements of two statutes and you are unsure of how one worked to the other. The other thing that here, what it means though is as you're thinking about next year, you should begin thinking about when you are going to be putting time and energy into working with your staff about the new requirements and about how this whole statute will change. We said before, there are elements that have changed and there are elements that haven't changed, but it is going to require you to do some focused work.
Yes, and there are a lot of issues or perspective on this new legislation that we urge you to keep in mind as we go forward. Honored, if you could move forward. We'll start digging in a little bit. But the shifts in decision-making overall in the law are greatly diminished at the federal level. There is significantly more authority at the state level to influence the areas that are highlighted on this slide. But just to give you a sense of the limitations at the federal level, there's explicit language in the new statute that limits the U.S. Department of Education Secretary's authority to put any conditions on the approval of a state plan moving forward. So again, as we get into the new Title I, states will be required to rewrite their plans. They've been writing plans. Now they're going to be required to consult with local stakeholders to draft new plans according to the new requirements. So the Secretary will have very limited authority in Title I to place any conditions on not only the plans or the waivers. So I say that emphatically. And to give you a sense of it, some of the language included in the law says, such as, the Secretary may not require a state to add new requirements, delete specific elements of its standards, prescribe goals, prescribe indicators, weight any measures of indicators of accountability, prescribe methodology, prescribe minimum end sizes, or prescribe any teacher or principal evaluation. Again, under this law, there is no requirement for teacher or principal evaluation. It is all at the choice of the state or the district. So just so you're also aware, there are some limitations on the Secretary's authority to issue non-binding policy guidance in the case where it may produce an exhaustive list of things that a state or a district could do to implement a requirement of the law. So as you can see, the sense and the big takeaway is that the majority of the authority on federal education is now shifted to the states to make determinations about their plans and their programs that they want to direct their federal money to. This is very reflective of the bipartisan nature of the whole bill. This was a big priority of Republicans going into the debate. They sought to not only streamline and consolidate programs, and I think we were up to the tune of about 49 different programs that were consolidated under the new authorization. And then they wanted to make sure that there were fewer overall buckets of funding and that those buckets of funding could be used in the most flexible manner possible. So Title I really does that.
But just to be clear, Kelly, what you were talking about is what the Secretary can't do. It doesn't mean that in the statute that goals and procedures aren't outlined. So it doesn't mean that the federal role has been diminished to the point of non-existence.
Right.
What it means is the Congress makes the laws, and they are saying to the federal executive branch, you may not go any further than what our intent is and what our requirements are.
That's right. Okay, so we're going to dig in really quickly, just so you can see the general language about standards adoption by the states that's in the bill. Now, really what's most important here, what can principals do? What can and should they do? Well, stay the course. As Rich said earlier, start thinking about what you can be doing with your teachers and your teams as you transition to a new law and what you need in your buildings. If you've been doing any work with your state on standard setting or shifts, that work will continue. This is really just underscoring at the federal level that there's not much intrusion beyond asking states to provide an assurance that they're adopting challenging academic standards.
And the state, by the way, has to submit those. The Secretary, and this is a good example of how the authority is limited, he may or she may choose not to accept those standards, but you can't say essentially what has to be done to meet those standards. The state is not being either coerced or encouraged in a certain direction. The Secretary can only say this meets the requirement as outlined by the statute or not.
Right. And if states choose to change their standards, they need to just simply submit it in writing.
Correct.
Okay, we can keep going. Okay, again, on assessments, basically the assessment provisions in the new law maintain current law. So you can see here. Some of the other changes that would be interesting to principals, and this is really important, is that each state is required to have at the state's discretion, actually, a measure of individual student growth for all students in all subgroups. And state systems can measure achievement through an annual summative assessment or multiple statewide assessments, which would be combined to produce a summative score. Again, the law allows but does not require states to set limits on the amount of time that would be devoted in the aggregate to assessment administration, including preparation. So states can also exclude a recently arrived English learner from one administration of reading or ELA assessments, or exclude the results of the English learner from the state's accountability system for the first year of enrollment. And just one other quick fact about the new law, it places a cap on 1% on the total number of students in the state that can be assessed using alternate assessments for students with significant cognitive disabilities.
And this, too, is an example what is in the statute about opting out. In black letter law, what it says in the statute is that the federal government may not usurp a state or local opt-out procedure. However, having said that, and this is kind of gives you a flavor for what the balance is between state, federal, and local role, the feds have said that in terms of the assessment accountability procedures, the numbers have to add up to 95% of the student body. And so how that is going to be done is something that is going to differ from locality and to state, but you can see how the feds are trying to set targets and goals and have procedures and processes essentially adjudicated at the local level.
Right. And there'll be one of two ways they can calculate that 95%, either as a percentage of a subgroup population or of the entire student body. That will be a state-determined methodology. So let's advance. We can talk a little bit more about that particular fact. So as you'll see, the new accountability system, states are required to develop an index with measured long-term goals that they will be measured to assess those three factors. Again, they need to be ambitious, state-designed long-term goals to assess the academic achievement on state assessments, graduation rates, and most importantly, progress of English language learners. So digging into this a little bit more, these four factors here really comprise what the new state accountability index needs to be based on. About the intent of these indicators, and as you'll see, I will describe a little bit about these measures, that they have to be reported for all students and separately for each subgroup. So we've maintained that data disaggregation that we did like about NCLB. And that states would not be allowed to look at an all average for the purpose of rating or differentiating schools. Again, states in their index have to focus on how they're going to differentiate schools. And by the way, if you missed it on our slide about overview, they've retained the requirement that states produce report cards. Again, these indicators will measure proficiency of all students in all subgroups on statewide assessments in reading and math for all schools, and for elementary and middle schools, they can use a measure of student growth or another valid and reliable academic indicator. For high schools, it's graduation rates according to the state goals. So back to that 95% real fast. One last indicator beyond a measure of school quality, which is where we think principals need to weigh in. States can give substantial weight to 95% participation rate, but that's not required by statute. What is required by statute is that these first four indicators have weight in the index. So the state must give significant weight to indicators 1 through 4, so proficiency, graduation rates, and another academic indicator for elementary and English language learners, and in the aggregate, 1 through 4 must be weighted higher than number 5. Number 5 was that getting 95% in the testing administration. Now, this is very complicated. So you talk about discussions that are going on. I heard someone describe the new accountability system as looking at a painting and trying to interpret it with your hands tied behind your back and one eye open. So it's going to be very consuming at the state and district level. But again, principals need to know that states will be devising new plans to discuss these indexes, how they will be developing, and principals have an opportunity to weigh in on what we think, at least from my perspective, and I'm curious what Rich will have to say on these two issues. I believe these are the two most important issues principals need to speak up on and engage your state and local officials. In the statute, it actually requires state and local officials to consult with educators. And now's the time for you to stand up and speak out on issues of school quality that you think are important to include in your state's accountability system. The federal policy has now opened the door for this for the first time, and we couldn't be more excited about multiple measures.
The reality of all this is that if you did read through this part of the statute, you'd find it very technical, and you'd say this is much more specific than I was led to believe. And the reason being is that they're trying to balance off the civil rights aspects of targeting funds, resources, and attention towards those students who are most in need. And then for Title I, that's usually meaning about economically disadvantaged. And so how these indices and indicators are actually balanced against each other, what numbers are used in one community is going to be vastly different from another, because frankly in No Child Left Behind there was a heavy emphasis on urban and concentrations there, and we saw and heard quite a bit about issues related to rural education and rural educators. Very quickly on additional topics, I think given our time, we just want to mention a couple of these here. First off, social-emotional learning. The reason we put this on the list is because in the past, this was a permissive activity that you would interpret to be permissive. In the statute, both for Title I and through other parts of it, there's a lot about anti-bullying, a lot about social-emotional learning, and other emotionally related activities. In terms of English learners in Title I and Title III, one of the big changes is they put in statute the reality that Title I had been doing the compliance monitoring on Title III for the last several years. In fact, I think it's probably over 5 years. The other thing that we'll see throughout the program is big changes in professional development that you'll talk about in other places with Title II, but also in terms of how mentoring and other activities relate to school districts that have high concentrations of Title I students. So it's there are specifics in other sections that can be applied here. One of the things we did also want to mention to you is about direct student services. This is a requirement that allows up to 3% of the funds to be used for personalized learning approaches, which may include high-quality academic tutoring. And what we mentioned earlier on about parent involvement, actually 1% of the funds can be used to communicate with parents about how this tutoring funding program for direct services could be used.
And that's a state option again, just to underscore that point. And also, that is also a provision that's included as part of the school improvement support intervention. And states will be, similar to current law, able to reserve either 7% of their Title I Part A funds for school improvement activities, or if their allotment was greater under current law, they can choose to receive what they previously received under the current statute. So those are, I think, important for principals to understand and know about, especially to the extent that you can be using your Title I funds to communicate with parents and engage them in your work and your vision.
And some of the political interests involved in constructing this law are touting this as a major win for one political perspective versus another. So you're going to hear about it.
Right.
In the next slide, we have some important mechanics to note. First off, a maintenance of effort is still there, and it of course requires that 90% of the funds that were used in the previous year are still going to be there in the following year. That's still there. It is waivable by the Secretary of Education under very specific issues, such as if there's a catastrophe, both either economic or due to floods, etc., that then change the entire basis of that. There's also, as Kelly said earlier, supplement, not supplant, requirements are going to be part of the discussion on the rulemaking. Part of the reason is this is where that balance comes in between giving flexibility to help high-need kids and also making a requirement of how funds should be actually concentrated. Title I originally was to be in addition to state and local funding. However, when we see programs like multi-tiered systems of support, it becomes increasingly more difficult to interpret both the spirit and the intent of the law in a clear way. And we're hoping to see more data coming out, or more guidance coming out of the department that would allow, again, for not to disturb the traditional emphasis of Title I, but at the same time to give the appropriate flexibility where needed. And we're also going to hear a little bit more about this as the issues related to uses of technology, purchase of equipment, and those kinds of activities. The other thing I wanted to mention on this slide, there's a certain amount of flexibility in Title I in funding that is throughout the statute that affects Title I. And in the way that is that under certain requirements, or certain conditions, your Title II money, some of your Title money from rural ed, and some of even your Title IV money can be transferred to Title I. You may not transfer money out of Title I to these other programs. And quite frankly, there are about 4 or 5 different conditions here. So just be aware that this is a question you should be asking for both clarity purposes and how this will work.
And I would emphasize that we support or we don't support transferring money out of Title II at the expense of much needed professional learning for our teachers and certainly principals. So here's a summary. This was, again, very much in a nutshell on all of the material that we've been presenting on and discussing this afternoon refers to Title I Part A. I want to be clear about that. And so a few takeaways. There's much more, as Rich just said, flexibility and really empowering the inclusion of educators and practitioners and those in the field from the bottom to start speaking up and being more involved in how federal education dollars are directed and spent. There are big shifts in who is making the decisions, and most of those will now involve greater authority at the state level. Again, I didn't mean to say the Secretary will have no authority, but there's very specific limitations on his ability to, his or her ability to influence and make specific decisions on behalf of states, and certainly when it comes to setting conditions for what states can or can't do. Big changes in processes. But again, there's an opportunity, and it's very specific or explicit in the legislation, for changes in processes and procedures that will affect the school building for principals to weigh in on those new processes and procedures. So We'll be working as the year goes on in the coming weeks and months to help principals identify those areas and levers. But most importantly, we want you to think about what's most important to you in your building. Now's the time to identify that and start thinking about how you can impact the change you need and according to your vision in your school. So here's a final poll. We'd like to ask anyone, just because we want to move to questions that are being submitted, we'd like to ask you to take a few seconds to review this question and submit any answers to that title1@naesp.org. Again, we're trying to collect information. This is a two-way street, not just provide you information in an overview. We'd like to collect some information from the field about your initial takeaways and perspective on Title I and how NAESP can best direct future presentations, webinars, and materials and provide them to the field. We'll be doing what I'm calling a sticky blog post. For those of you who have been to the NAESP website, on our homepage, we've had a standing blog post where we've been providing updates on the reauthorization of ESSA, and now we'll be shifting that to talk about implementation of ESSA.
And Kelly, generally speaking, what are you hearing out of the Department of Education right now by way of their effort to get all the rules, guidance, and information out there?
Well, I think it was telling how quickly after the final agreements were signed into law by the President, it was literally a 24-hour period, that they're not going to be wasting any time. Obviously, it's an election year. They have limited time left to get through, to launch and get through, as you pointed out, the negotiated rulemaking process, which can take a couple of months. And I think the idea is we've had a very involved Secretariat Administration in education. It continues to be a priority for the President and the administration, and they'll want to weigh in. You know, they did support the final agreement and the final law, and I think they'll have some very specific additions and perspective on provisions related to Title I specifically.
And I think you and I have talked about this in the past, how much the executive branch was being consulted through the rewrite, especially in the summer into the fall. So none of this stuff really was a surprise to them.
No. There were, there's a lot of criticism against the Hill for moving things through quickly. But really, a lot of the provisions had been deeply discussed, not just in the past year, but in previous years. Which is why I pointed to, you can't discount the amount of work that went into the rewrite of NCLB prior to 2015. So I think they knew what was coming. They were aware. And I think the Hill was pretty aware of their priorities and what they wanted to see, which is why you see that bottom 5% in the lowest performing schools. As part of the accountability requirements.
Right. That idea of differentiating essentially when we're going to have a heavy federal role, heavy federal requirements, or heavy state requirements to the bottom 5% is quite significant.
Absolutely. Rich, maybe we can jump to a couple of questions, but before we do, I have a question for you. In your opinion, as I noted earlier, I still think you're the most expert Title I and federal education policy historian, but what do you think are the most important issues that principals should be concerned with right now?
Interestingly enough, I think there are so many points where principals are written in and their opinion is going to be sought. It is almost to the point that principals could be overwhelmed. I think that what's going to be important is to decide where you want to put your time, your energy into what aspect of this, because otherwise you'll be eaten away one bite at a time.
Right, and I think I couldn't agree more. The specifics on this new policy may seem overwhelming. And as we wanted to point out, there are a lot of things that didn't change. And there are very specific big shifts. So I think it's important, and we're seeing from our poll results the majority of the folks on the session are really concerned about the new accountability and assessment requirements.
Right. They are very technical in some aspects, but the big change, again, if for people to be thinking about right now, is in the previous iteration, the law was the law, and this is how you were going to do it. This is what you had to do. And here, there are balancing points, tipping points, where decisions are going to be made about what nuance fits where. At the same time, there's still going to be the very implicit requirements of helping the kids most in need, especially as defined by poverty. Things like, for example, the school-wide 40% change. I mean, that has been in statute before. However, this time what we're seeing is an encouragement for buildings even that have a less than 40% concentration of poverty to be allowed to use the school-wide procedures. This has a massive effect on things like supplement, not supplant. And so how you balance these things off, like we had a question earlier that essentially asked, can we, if we have a kid in Title I and they shift to special ed, does that mean they're no longer in Title I? Well, the answer, generally speaking, again, this isn't, 50% of all kids who are in special ed are in Title I too. They are both supposed to get services from both. How you integrate funds, how you integrate the data reporting is something very, very important. One other thing, Kelly, as we think about what's important for principals, is this idea of all of these areas where principals' opinions are being asked. Well, also it's areas where you're going to be asked for information for reporting purposes and essentially for justifying why you're going in one direction or another. So it isn't, even if you choose, that you can't afford the time, you don't have the energy, your building doesn't need that you to be involved in a certain set of issues, you still may well have to pay attention to these things because of the many, many reporting requirements that are there. Even though the Hill was very sensitive to the fact that that there's an abundance of reporting requirements, it's almost like a drug. They can't really do it. The other thing that's there is that the Title I community is always adjusting and always changing. And here we see this progress that has been happening over many, many years. An explicit example would be how technology in the previous statute was explicit. Here it is implicit in almost everything.
So I think we need to answer, or we have time for just a couple of important questions. A couple of you are asking, does this mean states will be redrawing or rewriting their standards? No, but again, not necessarily. You're going to have 50 different responses, and it will be up to the state.
And the state, one of the things that the statute was making clear is the federal government cannot require a specific testing system to be used. And so the standards have been the preview of the states, but the argument has been over two things. One, what instrument would be used, and then how the results of that data would be used to help her evaluate change the system. And those things have changed, but the standards themselves have been and continue to be the province of the state.
And with that, there's also a question about what it could mean for teacher and principal evaluation. So for those of you who are operating under waivers in your state, part of a condition of that waiver was that the state implement a teacher or a principal evaluation system. In many cases, your state had to change actual state statute in order to do that. So it will be, in large part, up to your state in the decisions at the state and local level whether or not a teacher or principal evaluation system continues. Now, with that said, we don't find it likely that states will up and just stop operating systems, particularly those who are well along their way and they have actually some really productive results as a component of their evaluation that encourage relationships between teachers and principals and constructive feedback. I know personally in the principals that I've worked with that they appreciate the ability to bolster their relationships with their teachers through evaluation. So how soon would you start hearing from your state about what's going to be in their plans? I wouldn't be surprised if many of you haven't already heard from them. But what we would encourage you is to not wait, to go ahead and reach out to your superintendent. Talk with your superintendent about their perspective, what they've heard at the state level. There will be meetings, and again, we've noted it many times, the statute holds states accountable for providing an assurance they're going to be consulting with practitioners as they're rewriting their plans.
I think it's also important to note that the states are also on a pretty fast learning curve. So the fact that there's negotiated rulemaking going on, the fact that that the feds won't be able to say anything definitive on everything until the summer means that, yes, the process has started and it won't be completed, so you won't be getting kind of the word until into the next school year.
So this final page, we hope it will provide you with what you can do and where you can go right now. The homepage of NAESP will be replacing one of our blogs to include this presentation and then additional supplemental materials on Title I. It's also where we'll be announcing future presentations, which won't just be webinars. We'll probably be holding open conference calls and comment periods for principals and other stakeholders to participate in. We'd also encourage you to go visit the Department of Education's new website that details communications, letters, and other new policy-related materials that are coming from the Federal Department of Education. And of course, please feel free to contact Rich or myself with very specific questions. We're getting ready to wind down right now in this webinar. We hope you have found it helpful and informative. I would encourage you to also, when you go to www.nasp.org, there's a slider that talks about passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act. When you click on that slider, you will find a full summary of the new legislation or the new law. Please take a few moments to read it. We've taken what was over 1,000-page agreement and boiled it down into about 30 pages, and we pulled the most important buckets within each title of the new law for principals. So please take a moment, since we hope you were relaxing during your Christmas holiday and didn't read it, to do so now. We'll be providing additional information on that website, as I mentioned, and we hope that you do contact us. Again, just reiterating, nothing in this presentation was meant for a legal interpretation on a school-based issue. It was to provide you with an overview of the new law. If you have a specific Title I question, please feel free to contact Rich or myself. So with that, we wish you a Happy New Year. We hope you'll continue to pay attention to the webinar presentation schedule. Thank you to Honor for your very adept mastery and monitoring and execution of this webinar. And please, everyone, weigh in with your thoughts, comments, questions. If we didn't get to a question or you have a burning question that remains, please feel free to submit it to title1@nasp.org. We will be monitoring this email and make sure to respond to each and every one of the questions or comments. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day.